There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Caden Voss, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine protection during warp transit. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The screaming never stops in my mind now, an echo of what I witnessed beyond the Gellar Fields' fragile barrier. What the Imperium tells its citizens about warp travel is a comforting lie, a thin veneer over a reality so horrifying that knowledge alone can shatter a mortal mind. I remember the cold metal of the observation deck beneath my ceramite boots, the distant hum of the Navigators' chamber several decks below. The vibration changed first, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the difference between a sleeping man's breath and one who has just seen his death approaching. I was a librarian of the Ultramarines' 4th Company, trained to sense the warp's malevolent whispers. But nothing prepared me for what happened aboard the Righteous Vindication during that fateful transit from Macrags to the Cadian Gate. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests speak of routine warp transit in their cold, mechanical voices, assuring passengers that the Gellar Field provides absolute protection. The ecclesiarchy preaches that the Emperor's light guides vessels through the Imperium. The Navis Nobilitae claims their navigators can always find safe passage through the Empyrean tides. All lies. Carefully constructed falsehoods designed to maintain the illusion that mankind can safely traverse the realm of nightmares. The truth would break the Imperium more surely than any Xenos invasion or heretical uprising. I still feel the psychic scream that tore through my consciousness when the Gellar Field fluctuated for just 2.7 seconds. Not a failure. Merely a fluctuation. That's all it takes. In that moment, I saw what lurks just beyond the Emperor's light, what watches every Imperial vessel that dares enter the warp, and worse, what waits for each human soul foolish enough to believe they are merely passengers on a journey through hell, rather than morsels of psychic energy being dangled before hungry gods. The Imperium's darkest secret isn't just what exists in the warp. It's what the warp does to those who witness its true nature, even for a fraction of a second. I know because I am what remains of such a witness. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Tholon Vex, and I once believed in the sanctity of warp travel. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The Imperium is not merely a realm of nightmares. It is a conscious malevolence that hungers for mortal souls, and the Imperium's methods of traversing it are built upon technologies we barely understand, and horrors we deliberately forget. I still remember the first breach. The klaxons screamed their warning as I sprinted through the corridors of the strike cruiser Righteous Vengeance. The air grew thick, viscous, as if reality itself was dissolving around me. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. Not my own fear, but that of the 1,000 souls aboard. As a librarian of the Ultramarines, I was trained to sense the psychic emanations of those around me. But what I felt in that moment transcended mere human terror. It was the collective dread of prey animals sensing the approach of an apex predator. The Gellar Field had failed for only 3.7 seconds, less than 4 heartbeats, not even enough time for the tech priests to register the failure in their cogitator logs. But in the warp, time has no meaning. What was a mere moment in real space was an eternity for the demons that clawed at the thinning veil between dimensions. I saw what came through. I saw what they did to Navigator Quintus. I saw how they unmade him, not just in body, but in soul, retroactively erasing his existence from the Emperor's light. The official records state he died of heart failure. The Inquisition made certain of that. The truth is something the common citizens of the Imperium must never know. For knowledge itself is the first vector of corruption, and the horrors of warp travel would break the sanity of those who depend upon it. Now I sit entombed in this dreadnought sarcophagus, my psychic powers dulled by age and trauma, recounting truths that will be purged from the archives the moment I cease function. But you will listen. You must listen. For the warp's true nature is the greatest secret the Imperium hides, and the thin barrier of the Gellar Field is all that stands between humanity and damnation. This is not merely a warning. It is a confession, and perhaps, in some small way, it is my penance. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Gellar Voss, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine guidance through the warp. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The nightmares never cease, even after 3 centuries entombed in this sarcophagus. The silence between battles is worse than any Xeno's scream. It's then that I remember what I witnessed in the Imperium. I still recall the metallic taste that flooded my mouth when our Gellar Field fluctuated during transit to the Sheridan sector. The Navigators' screams echoed through the Vox as something reached through the barrier, not to kill us, but to show us. That's what the Imperium hides from its citizens. Death in the warp isn't what you should fear. It's what comes before death that breaks even the strongest minds. My battle brothers speak of me as a hero, the ancient one who survived the nightmare transit of the Obsidian Star. The chapter's serfs whisper prayers when they polish my dreadnought chassis. If they knew what truly happened during those 9 subjective years of warp travel, what felt like millennia to those of us trapped within, they would burn my memory from the chapter's records. The Imperium doesn't merely hide the danger of warp travel from its citizens. It conceals the philosophical horror that time, space, and consciousness are but fragile constructs in a universe that cares nothing for the sanctity of the human mind. Scene Q. Scene Q. Flickering blue emergency lumens cast shadows across a dreadnought sarcophagus, with frost forming on its ancient metal surface as internal systems hum with artificial life. Merc. Section. Setup descent. Duration sec. 540. Content. My name is Epistolary Gellar Voss, Crimson Fist's librarian, now ancient venerable of the First Company, entombed beneath the Arx Tyrannus on Rin's world since the Battle of Traitors' Gorge, M41.997. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Rin's Fall when the Greenskin Horde nearly destroyed our chapter. The Arx Tyrannus was my home, where I trained generations of psyker neophytes in the controlled use of their gifts. But signs of corruption were already there. The whispers that came to me during meditation, the shadows that moved against the light in the librarium. I remember the weight of my psychic hood, how it would press against my temples during warp transit, a blessed dampening of the voices beyond. Brother Captain Alves noticed my discomfort during our voyage to the Badab sector. "Your eyes," he said. "They change color when we enter the Imperium." I dismissed his concerns. Hubris, the arrogance of a psyker who believed his training sufficient against the horrors between stars. Our vessel, the Oath of Stone, was a venerable strike cruiser that had served the chapter for 15 centuries. The navigator house Belisarius had guided our ships for generations, their mutated forms a necessary abomination in service to mankind's expansion. The mission seemed straightforward. Transport a strike force to reinforce our brothers fighting in the Sheridan sector against a splinter of Hive Fleet Kraken. Routine warp travel, they said. 7 standard weeks in the Imperium. Chapter Master Pedro Cantor himself gave us the Emperor's blessing before departure, pressing his gauntleted hand to my forehead in the ritual of safe passage. I can still feel the cold ceramite against my skin, a final human touch before everything changed. The ship's Gellar Field generators were triple-checked by the tech marines. Brother Dorian, master of the forge, personally blessed the machine spirits with sacred unguents and chanted the litanies of protection for 17 hours before our departure. Every precaution was taken, every ritual observed. The first 3 weeks passed without incident. The navigator, Hieronymus Belisarius, was a withered figure whose third eye pulsed beneath its silken covering. He rarely spoke except through his attendants, conserving his strength for the constant vigilance required to guide our vessel through the Imperium's treacherous currents. I would visit the navigation chamber daily, ostensibly to report on the psychic health of the battle brothers. But in truth, I was drawn to the warp sense emanating from that chamber. It called to my psychic abilities like the ocean calls to a man dying of thirst, promising power but concealing danger. In the navigation sanctum, surrounded by warding sigils and burning incense, Hieronymus would sometimes speak directly into my mind. "The currents grow strange, epistolary," he whispered on the 23rd day. "Something watches us from the deep places." I should have heeded his warning, should have advised Captain Alves to drop from the warp at the nearest safe point. Instead, I assured the navigator that the Emperor protects. The first sign of true danger came when Servitor Unit 37 Delta malfunctioned during routine maintenance of the tertiary plasma conduits. The mindless creature, little more than a collection of organs and machinery, suddenly began speaking in perfect High Gothic, reciting passages from texts I had studied centuries ago in the chapter's Forbidden Archives. Texts describing the nature of time in the warp. When security protocols were enacted and the servitor was examined by Tech Marine Solace, no explanation could be found. The cogitator-enhanced brain showed no anomalies, no signs of corruption or malfunction. "A ghost in the machine," Brother Solus concluded, before performing the rite of decommissioning. I remember watching the servitor's remaining human eye as the power was disconnected. It looked directly at me, and I swear by the throne that it smiled. That night, in my meditation chamber, I dreamed of that eye, growing larger until it engulfed the ship, the sector, the galaxy itself. And beyond it, things moved in patterns that hurt to perceive. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Nathaniel Kress, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine protection during warp travel. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The nightmares that plague me now are not dreams, but memories. Fragments of reality too horrific for the human mind to process whole. The taste of copper fills my mouth as I recall what I witnessed in the Imperium, what I became part of, if only for moments that stretched into eternity. The navigators call it the gaze, that moment when a mortal's eyes meet the raw chaos of the warp, unfiltered by Gellar Fields or the navigator's third eye. The Imperium tells its citizens that warp travel is merely uncomfortable, a necessary discomfort in service to the Emperor. They speak of mild nightmares, of temporal disorientation, of the need for navigator houses. What they hide is the true nature of what lies beyond the thin membrane of reality. Entities that hunger for the essence of humanity itself, that see our souls as morsels to be consumed, playthings to be tortured for millennia of subjective time. I served as Medici officer aboard the Solemnity of Faith, a lunar-class cruiser in service to Battlefleet Calixis. 73 warp transits I had endured without incident, protected by faith and ignorance in equal measure. On the 74th, during the Orpheus salient campaign, I witnessed what happens when a navigator's concentration slips for but a heartbeat. I saw what happens when the veil is pierced. The sounds still echo in my mind, the screams of 3,000 souls as reality itself became malleable, as the laws of physics bent and broke under pressures no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. The bulkheads of the Medici deck seemed to breathe, to pulse with malevolent life. And then the whispers began. Scene Q. Scene Q. Extreme close-up of a human eye with the pupil dilating to reveal swirling, unnatural colors within as a reflection of the warp appears. Wastno. Section. Setup Descent. Duration Sec. 540. Content. My name is Nathaniel Kress, Medici Primus of the Imperial Navy, assigned to Battlefleet Calixis. Entombed beneath the Bastion Sepulchral on Scintilla since the Orpheus Salient campaign, M41.817. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Tranche, tended the wounded at the siege of Vaxenide. The Bastion Sepulchral was my home, its cold stone corridors a comfort after the horrors of void warfare. But signs of corruption were already there. The way my hands would shake when preparing for warp translation. The dreams of drowning in an ocean of eyes that would not close even when I was awake. The navigator assigned to our vessel was Hieronymus Fane of House Fane Minor, a wizened figure whose withered body belied the power contained within his mutant brain. His third eye remained forever hidden behind an ornate golden mask, worked with wards and sigils said to focus his abilities and protect those around him from accidental exposure to his gaze. The crew gave him wide berth, as was proper. Only Captain Thalassos and I, as senior medicae, were permitted regular contact. Fane's quarters were a sanctum of incense and ancient tomes, star charts covering the walls and ceiling in patterns that hurt the eyes if observed too long. The navigator's attendants, mute servitors with their eyes and ears surgically removed, tended to his needs with mechanical precision. We had been tasked with reinforcing the Orpheus Salient, a thrust of Imperial forces into the Jericho Reach. The journey required multiple warp jumps, navigating through regions known for their turbulence. Captain Thalassos was a veteran of such passages, his face bearing the scars of 30 years' void service. The Emperor protects, he would say before each translation, but a wise man trusts in Gellar Fields. The ship's tech priests performed the rituals of activation with painstaking care, anointing the field generators with sacred oils, chanting the litanies of warding. I observed these ceremonies with clinical detachment, noting how the crew's collective anxiety manifested in elevated heart rates, pupil dilation, increased perspiration. As medicae, I prescribed mild sedatives for those whose duties permitted such indulgence. For the rest, I recommended prayer. 3 days before the incident, Navigator Fane requested my presence. His chambers reeked of chemical, stimulants and xanthic incense, the latter technically prohibited, but tolerated given his status. "You've never seen it, have you, Medici Kress?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. "The true face of the warp?" I admitted I had not, that my knowledge was limited to what was taught at the Schola Progenium, that the Imperium was a realm of energy and thought, dangerous but navigable with proper guidance. Fane's laugh was like cracking parchment. "The Imperium's greatest mercy is ignorance," he said. "The warp is not empty space between stars. It is alive. It hungers. It watches." I dismissed his words as the ramblings of an overtaxed mind, perhaps early signs of navigator psychosis. I increased his dosage of stabilizers and noted in my log that he should be monitored for further deterioration. Brother Chaplain Mordath had warned me of such heretical thoughts, how even the most loyal servants could be corrupted by proximity to the warp. I should have heeded the signs. The day of our final translation dawned with an unnatural stillness throughout the ship. The void outside seemed darker, the stars dimmer. Crew members reported dreams of drowning, of voices calling their names from within the bulkheads. I documented these phenomena as standard pre-translation anxiety, recommending increased prayer sessions and vigilance against potential panic. In the Engineerium, Tech Priest Dominus Vark oversaw the rituals of awakening the warp engines, the massive plasma reactors thrumming with barely contained power. The ship's astropath, Severin Locks, had fallen into a catatonic state hours before, blood leaking from his augmetic eye sockets, another ill omen I failed to properly interpret. Captain Thalassos ordered him sedated and restrained, lest his condition be contagious. We were committed to our course. The reinforcements we carried were too vital to the war effort to delay. The translation klaxon sounded throughout the ship. In the Medicae deck, I secured the critical patients and prepared emergency protocols. The ship shuddered as reality began to tear open before our prow. The last thing I heard over the Vox before translation was Navigator Fane's voice, unusually clear and calm. Emperor, forgive me for what they will see. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Caius Ven, and I once believed in the Emperor's light guiding us through the void. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The warp is not merely a realm of demons and madness. It is a mirror to our souls, and what I've seen there has shattered mine beyond recognition. The taste of iron floods my mouth as the neural connectors engage, ancient machinery binding my consciousness to the ship's systems. Even now, entombed within the heart of the strike cruiser Tempest's Wrath, I can feel the membrane between reality and nightmare growing thin. The Gellar Field generators hum with a frequency that has become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, sound that once brought comfort but now carries only dread. The pitch changes subtly, almost imperceptibly, but I notice. I always notice. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests speak of the warp in clinical terms, a dimensional realm that enables faster-than-light travel, a necessary evil for maintaining the Imperium across vast galactic distances. The Ecclesiarchy preaches of spiritual fortitude against its corruption. The Imperial Navy trains its navigators to chart paths through its turbulent tides. But none of them tell the common citizens what truly happens when a ship's Gellar Field fluctuates during transit. They cannot know what I have witnessed. The transformations, the whispers, the bleeding of nightmares into reality when that protective bubble weakens even for a moment. Most Imperial citizens will never experience warp travel. They will live and die on the same world, beneath the same sun, blissfully ignorant of what their Imperium demands of those who traverse the Immaterium. This ignorance is by design. If the truth were known, if the masses understood what lurks beyond the veil, what happens to souls caught in transitional states between real space and the warp? The Imperium would collapse under the weight of its own terror. I carry this knowledge like a cancer, spreading through what remains of my humanity. And now I will share it with you, though the telling of it may damn us both. Scene Q. Scene Q. Extreme close-up on ancient, withered face with augmetic implants, eyes suddenly opening to reveal unnatural blue glow as neural connections engage. Knees no. Section. Setup, descent, duration sec. 540. Content. My name is Epistolary Caius Ven, Librarian of the Angels of Absolution, 3rd Company. Entombed beneath the fortress monastery of Absolution's Rock on the moon of Gravenhold since the Hive Fleet Kraken incursion, M41.9993. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Macon during the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. The chapter Librarius was my sanctuary, its ancient tomes and psychic wards my comfort. But signs of corruption were already there. Headaches that came when I gazed too long into the Imperium, whispers that lingered after my mind withdrew from communion with my battle brothers. We Space Marines are conditioned to face any horror without flinching, to stand resolute against the worst the galaxy can unleash. The hypno-indoctrination, the chemical treatments, the psycho-conditioning, all designed to render us immune to fear. And yet, nothing in my training prepared me for what I witnessed during that fateful warp transit from the Nephilim sector to the Hadron front. I remember it clearly. Despite the centuries that have passed, despite the slow deterioration of my organic brain as the augmetics gradually replace dying tissue, some memories cannot be excised, not even by the most skilled of Adeptus Mechanicus chirurgions. The Tempest's Wrath was a venerable strike cruiser, blessed by the chapter's chaplains and maintained with reverence by generations of tech priests. Its machine spirit was said to be particularly aware, almost prescient in its ability to anticipate threats. Captain Rameus had led us to victory against the orc Wag in the Nephilim sector, and we were bearing the gene seed of our fallen brothers home when Navigator Hallis plotted our course through the warp. 17 battle brothers had given their lives in service to the Emperor. Their progenoid glands, carefully extracted and preserved, represented the future of our chapter. I can still see Brother Apothecary Tarek's face as he performed the sacred rites over each reliquary, his normally stoic features softened by grief and pride. We entered the warp with all proper rituals observed. The Gellar Field hummed to life, creating that protective bubble of real space around our vessel, the only barrier between us and the hungry entities that dwell in the Imperium. For 3 days by ship time, our journey proceeded without incident. I spent those days in meditation, strengthening my psychic wards and preparing myself for the campaigns to come. As a librarian, I was more sensitive than my battle brothers to the subtle pressures of warp travel, the faint scratching at the edges of consciousness, the distant howls that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Standard phenomena. Nothing to concern a trained psyker of the Adeptus Astartes. On the 4th day, I was summoned to the bridge by Captain Rameus. Navigator Hallis had reported unusual currents in the warp. Nothing dangerous, merely a phenomenon requiring additional vigilance. As I made my way through the armored corridors of the Tempest's Wrath, I noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the mortal crew. The serfs moved with unnatural haste, their eyes downcast, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. A tech priest I passed in the hallway was muttering binary cant to himself, his mechadendrites twitching spasmodically. I attributed these observations to the strain of warp travel on unaugmented human minds and continued to the bridge. Captain Rameus stood before the great viewing portal, though it was sealed during warp transit. His Terminator armor gleamed in the red emergency lighting, the chapter's heraldry displayed proudly on his pauldron. "Brother Librarian?" he acknowledged without turning. "I sense a disturbance in the warp. Subtle, but growing stronger. Navigator Hallis assures me it is nothing the ship cannot weather. But I would have your insight." I closed my eyes, extending my psychic senses cautiously. The captain was right. There was a disturbance, a ripple in the usual chaotic patterns of the Imperium. Not a storm, not yet, but a pressure building, like the atmosphere before a violent tempest. "A minor fluctuation, Captain," I reported, though something deep within me recognized the lie even as I spoke it. The Navigator's assessment seems correct. We should increase the frequency of Gellar Field monitoring as a precaution, but I see no immediate threat. Remaeus nodded, satisfied with my assessment. I should have been more forthright, should have shared the unease growing within me. But pride, that eternal sin of our kind, kept me silent. I was an epistolary of the Librarius, a veteran of 100 campaigns. What could the warp show me that I had not already faced and overcome? That night, as I attempted to find rest in my Spartan quarters, the dreams began. Not the usual fragmented images that come during brief Astartes sleep cycles, but vivid, coherent visions. I stood upon the surface of a world I did not recognize, beneath a sky the color of bruised flesh. The ground beneath my boots was not rock or soil, but something organic, something that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. In the distance, I could see the silhouettes of my battle brothers, their armor twisted into impossible shapes, their bolters fused to their hands like grotesque extensions of their flesh. They were calling to me, but their voices were wrong, layered, distorted, as though many entities spoke through each throat. I tried to reach them, but each step I took only seemed to increase the distance between us. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Thaddeus Varn, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine light guiding us through the Imperium. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The warp is not merely a realm of demons and madness. It is a prison of time itself, where seconds stretch into centuries and where a man can lose his very soul while his body remains intact. I feel the cold metal of my sarcophagus against what remains of my flesh. The interface ports burning like ice where they connect to my spine. The pain is a reminder that I still exist, though what I am now bears little resemblance to the proud librarian who once strode the halls of Fortress Hera on Macragge. The biomonitors hum their constant dirge, a mechanical lullaby that has been my only companion for what the ship's chronometers tell me has been merely 17 standard years. But I have lived millennia in the hell between heartbeats. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the Navigators Guild maintain their careful fiction about warp travel. They speak of immaterial translation and Imperium currents, in technical terms, to mask the horror. Even space marines are shielded from the full truth. But I know. Emperor, forgive me. I know what happens when the Gellar Field flickers for even a microsecond. I have seen time itself become unbound from reality, have watched as a man ages 1,000 years between one breath and the next, his mind experiencing every moment while his body remains untouched by the physical passage of time. This is the secret the Imperium hides from its citizens, that warp travel doesn't merely risk corruption or death, but something infinitely worse: temporal damnation. Scene Q. Scene Q. A withered space marine dreadnought, in darkened stasis chamber, bio-runes flickering across its sarcophagus, while frost forms on ancient ceramite. Nost. Section. Setup. Descent. Duration. Sec. 540. Content. My name is Epistolary Thaddeus Varn, Ultramarines 4th Company Librarian, entombed beneath the Fortress of Hera on Macragge since the siege of Talwa's Landing, M41.897. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Damnos against the Necron Awakening. The Fortress of Hera was my home, but signs of corruption were already there. Psychic migraines that came with increasing frequency, visions of time folding upon itself like origami of madness. I remember standing upon the observation deck of the strike cruiser's ceaseless vigilance as we prepared for warp translation. Captain Agamon had tasked our detachment with reinforcing the beleaguered Imperial forces on Talwa's Landing, where a chaos uprising threatened to destabilize the entire Talwa system. The Navigator, a withered woman named Esmeralda Vor, her third eye concealed behind an ornate golden mask, had assured us of a swift journey, no more than 3 weeks in the warp. Brother Caius joked that he would barely have time to clean his bolter before we arrived. We laughed then. Emperor, forgive us, we laughed. The Gellar Field hummed to life around our vessel, that invisible bubble of real space that would protect us from the predations of the Imperium. I felt the familiar psychic pressure as we translated, the momentary disorientation that all psychers experience when entering the warp. But this time, something was different. I sensed a thinness to the field, like fabric stretched too taut, ready to tear. I should have spoken then, should have demanded we return to real space immediately. But pride stayed my tongue. I was an epistolary of the Ultramarines, and I would not show weakness before my battle brothers over what might be mere paranoia. On the 3rd day of warp travel, by ship time, the Navigator summoned me to her sanctum. The air was heavy with incense, the walls lined with chronometers of all designs, some imperial, others clearly Xenos in origin. "You feel it too, don't you, librarian?" she whispered, her voice like parchment crumbling to dust. The thinning of the veil. Time does not flow as it should in this passage. I admitted my concerns, and she nodded gravely. The warp storms grow more violent with each passing year. The Emperor's Astronomicon flickers like a candle in the wind. We navigators see what others cannot. That time itself is becoming unstable within the Imperium. She showed me her logbooks, centuries of careful observations. Instances where vessels had emerged from the warp to find decades had passed in real space, though only weeks had elapsed for the crew. More disturbing were the accounts of the opposite phenomenon. Ships arriving at their destinations seemingly before they had departed, creating temporal paradoxes that the Inquisition quickly suppressed. "But these," she said, pointing to a sealed folio marked with an inquisitorial seal, "these are the cases that the Imperium hides most carefully. The time-lost souls, those who experience subjective millennia within their own minds while trapped in warp transit." The Navigator explained that the human mind exists partially in the warp. It is what allows psychers to draw their power, what gives all humans their souls. During warp travel, the Gellar Field creates a bubble of real space that protects the physical body. But the mind can sometimes slip its moorings, experiencing time at a different rate than the body. Most humans are mercifully oblivious, their consciousness protected by their very lack of psychic sensitivity. But psychers, especially powerful ones like space marine librarians, are at greater risk. "Your mind touches the warp directly," she warned. "If the Gellar Field weakens, even for a moment." I left her sanctum troubled, but resolute. I increased my meditative practices, strengthening my mental wards as chapter doctrine prescribed. I spoke with Brother Chaplain Orton, who offered prayers to the Emperor to shield my thoughts. But I did not speak to Captain Agaman. I did not request that we drop back into real space to assess the Gellar Field generators. That decision would haunt me for subjective eons to come. On the 7th day, ship time, was in my chambers conducting the rite of psychic cleansing when I felt it. A tremor in the warp, a ripple that passed through the Gellar Field like a stone disturbing the surface of a pond. For a microsecond, no more than the time between heartbeats, the field wavered. To most aboard, it would have registered as nothing more than a momentary flicker of the lumens, perhaps a strange dream quickly forgotten upon waking. But I felt my mind slip its anchors, felt time itself become untethered around me. The ship's warning klaxons blared moments later. Gellar Field fluctuation detected. The monotone voice of the ship's machine spirit announced. Integrity restored. Threat level. Minimal. Minimal, if only they knew. If only I had realized what had already begun within my mind. The Navigator knew. When I encountered her in the corridor outside the bridge, her face was ashen beneath her mask. "Emperor protect you, librarian," she whispered. I sensed the disruption. "Your mind..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I already felt the first symptoms. Memories that seemed to stretch for days, though only hours had passed. Dreams that lasted centuries while I slept for minutes. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Thaddeus Varn, and I once believed in the Emperor's guiding light through the darkness of the void. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The warp is not merely a realm of transit. It is a living nightmare that hungers for mortal souls. I know this because I have felt its cold touch upon my mind, whispering promises and horrors in equal measure. The taste of copper floods my mouth as I recall that final voyage aboard the strike cruiser Oath of Moment. The Navigator's screams still echo through my dreams, her third eye bleeding as reality tore itself apart around us. The Gellar Field had not failed completely, but it had fluctuated just enough for them to see us, to touch us, to mark us. The Imperium speaks of the warp as a necessary evil, a turbulent sea that must be crossed to maintain the Emperor's domain. They tell the common citizenry that the Emperor's light guides vessels safely through its tumultuous tides. The ecclesiarchy preaches that faith shields the righteous from its corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus assures that their technologies provide adequate protection. These are comforting lies, spread to maintain order and prevent mass hysteria. The truth would break the minds of billions and invite rebellion, heresy, and worse. What I have witnessed in the Imperium defies sanity itself, where time flows backwards and forwards simultaneously, where the laws of physics are suggestions at best, where entities of pure malevolence watch and wait for the slightest opportunity. The Navigators know, the astropaths know, and now I know too. The knowledge has hollowed me out, leaving nothing but a shell of duty and dread. I share this forbidden knowledge not to spread fear, but as a warning. For in the grim darkness of the far future, ignorance may truly be the only mercy the Emperor grants his subjects. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Cardin Voss, and I once believed in the Emperor's guiding light across the void. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The Imperium is not merely a realm of demons and madness. It is a sentient hunger that remembers every soul that passes through its currents, and it never truly lets us go. I still recall the metallic taste of fear flooding my mouth as our Gellar Field fluctuated during transit to the Sheridan sector. The Navigator's screams echoed through the void ship's corridors as something reached through the thinning barrier between real space and the warp. Not with claws or fangs, but with whispers that slithered into the minds of the crew. Whispers that promised to reveal the truth the Imperium has hidden for millennia. The Adeptus Mechanicus technicians frantically performed the sacred rites of maintenance, their mechadendrites dancing across ancient control panels as incense clouded the bridge. But I knew then what I know now. Their rituals were mere theater. The true nature of warp travel is not recorded in any imperial text accessible to common citizens. Even most space marines are shielded from the horrifying reality of what happens when human consciousness traverses the sea of souls. The librarius taught me to shield my mind, to build psychic fortifications against the predators of the warp. But they never told me that during those weeks or months of transit, as our physical forms remained in stasis, parts of our souls drift through the currents of the Imperium. Fragments of our consciousness experience eternities of torment or ecstasy, while our bodies cross the galaxy. The Imperium's greatest lie is not that the Emperor protects. It's that we return from the warp whole and unchanged. Scene Q. Scene Q. A lone space marine helmet reflecting swirling warp energies, eye lenses flickering with fading light as tendrils of psychic energy curl around the ceramite. Course, section, setup, descent, duration, Homer's Sec, 540, content. My name is Epistolary Carden Voss, Ultramarines Chapter Chief Librarian, entombed beneath the fortress of Hera on Macragge since the devastation of Baal campaign, M41.9999. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Damnos against the Necron awakening. The fortress of Hera was my home, but signs of corruption were already there. Dreams of drowning in an ocean of screaming faces, psychic echoes that lingered long after I'd withdrawn from the minds of my battle brothers. The first time I suspected something was wrong was after the Kruach campaign. We had made 17 warp jumps in rapid succession, pursuing a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Leviathan through the Ultima Segmentum. Each transit lasted no more than a few days in real space, but something about the cumulative effect began to change me. I found myself remembering events from the perspective of Brother Talon, who had been stationed at the forward observation port during our third transit. I recalled the exact pattern of frost that had formed on his gauntlet, a detail I could not possibly have known. Chaplain Cassius noticed my distraction during the rites of battle before we made planetfall on Kruach 4. "Your mind wanders, Brother Voss," he said, his skull helm betraying no emotion. "The Emperor's light must be your anchor in the void." I did not tell him that during our last warp transit, I had experienced what felt like decades trapped in a crystal labyrinth where every reflection showed a different version of myself. Some wore the colors of other chapters. Some bore the mutations of the ruinous powers. One wore the inquisitorial rosette. Time in the warp is not linear, and I was beginning to suspect that neither was identity. The Codex Astartes contains 13 sealed sections that only librarians of the 5th rank may access. Within those passages, Robert Gilliman himself wrote of the dangers of repeated warp exposure to those with psychic sensitivity. The librarian serves as the chapter's shield against the predations of the Imperium, he wrote, yet in doing so becomes the membrane through which corruption may seep. I had read these words 100 times, but only now did I understand their true meaning. Every transit through the warp leaves a psychic imprint upon the traveler. For nulls and non-psychers, this imprint is negligible, a bad dream quickly forgotten upon waking. For psychers like myself, each passage carves deeper channels through which the Imperium can flow into real space. Tech Marine Antaeus had been tasked with maintaining the Gellar Field generators aboard our strike cruiser, the Sword of Ultramar. After our return from Kruach, I sought him out in the ship's engineerium. The chamber was thick with the scent of sacred oils and the low drone of machine spirits. "Brother Librarian," he greeted me, his servo harness whirring as he turned. "What brings you to my domain?" I asked him what he knew of the Gellar Fields' true function. His augmetic eye flickered, and he motioned for his attendant servitors to leave us. "The Gellar Field does not merely repel the denizens of the warp," he said quietly. "It creates a bubble of real space logic within the Imperium. But logic is anathema to the warp, and the warp resents the intrusion. Antaius explained that the Adeptus Mechanicus has known since the dark age of technology that the Gellar Field does not provide perfect isolation. It is a permeable membrane, not an impenetrable barrier. The warp bleeds through in subtle ways, particularly during prolonged transit or when passing through warp storms. Think of it as osmosis, he said. The longer the exposure, the more the two sides seek equilibrium. This was heretical knowledge, information that would see common citizens executed for even hearing it. But for those who routinely traveled the warp, navigators, astropaths, space marines, it was a necessary truth, carefully obscured beneath layers of ritual and dogma. The chapter's archives held records from the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's fleets first began to traverse the galaxy in force. Reports from that era spoke of entire ships returning from the warp, with crews that seemed unchanged, until subtle differences in behavior emerged weeks or months later. Sometimes it was as minor as a preference for different foods or an aversion to certain colors. Other times, entire personalities had been altered, memories rewritten, loyalties shifted. The Imperium solution was to establish rigorous quarantine protocols and psychological screening for void travelers. But as the Imperium expanded and warp travel became commonplace, such precautions became impractical. Instead, the truth was buried, accessible only to those with the highest levels of clearance. In the Medicae chamber beneath the fortress of Hera, Chief Apothecary Tigurius conducted regular examinations of the librarius. "Your neural patterns show signs of temporal distortion," he told me after one such examination, consistent with extended exposure to non-linear time. When I asked what this meant for my future service, his expression grew grave. The human mind, even one enhanced as ours, is not designed to process multiple temporal realities simultaneously. In the worst cases, the psychic feedback creates a cascade failure. He did not need to elaborate. I had seen the results myself. Librarians whose minds had fractured, becoming vessels for warp entities, or, perhaps more mercifully, descending into catatonia. The chapter called it the burden of knowledge. Now I understood. It was the burden of remembering things that both had and had not happened to me across countless potential realities glimpsed during warp transit. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Thaddeus Varn, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine protection during warp travel. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The metal walls of my quarters aboard the strike cruiser, Righteous Vengeance, vibrate with a frequency no mortal ear should perceive. Yet I feel it in the hollows of my bones, in the cavities where my humanity once resided. The warp calls to me still, even after all these centuries. The Gellar Field is failing. Not here, not now, but in my memories, eternally replaying like a broken voxcaster. I remember the screams of 3,000 souls as reality tore apart around us. The Navigator's third eye weeping blood. The ship's corridors bending in impossible geometries. These are not simply horrors I witnessed, but truths the Imperium conceals from its citizens. The Administratum classifies the true nature of warp travel as Level 9 prohibited knowledge, accessible only to those with sufficient clearance and spiritual fortitude. They are right to do so. I still recall the taste of copper in my mouth as I recited the litany of protection, my psychic hood burning white-hot against my temples. The warp is not merely a dimension of chaotic energy, as the simplified imperial propaganda suggests to the masses. It is a sentient ocean of suffering, where the laws of physics surrender to the whims of emotions given form. When a vessel's Gellar field flickers for even a microsecond, the barrier between materium and immaterium becomes permeable. What happens in that instant would shatter the sanity of any loyal Imperial citizen. I know because I watched it happen to my battle brothers, one by one. Scene Q. Scene Q. Blue-white light of a failing Gellar field flickers across a space marine's face, revealing momentary glimpses of horror in his eyes. Section. Setup, Descent, Duration Sec, 540, Content. My name is Epistolary Thaddeus Varn, Librarian of the Crimson Fists chapter, entombed beneath the Arx Tyrannus on Rin's world since the Wa. Snagrod, M41.989. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Bad Landing alongside Captain Cortez. The Arx Tyrannus was my home. But signs of corruption were already there. Psychic migraines that lasted for days, visions of things no loyal servant of the Emperor should see. I served as battle psyker aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Vengeance during the Calidus campaign. Our mission was to transport a relic of immense value, the chronometer of St. Belisarius, from the Forge World Griffon of Four to the Fortress Monastery. The chronometer was said to contain temporal fragments from the dark age of technology, capable of calculating warp tide patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Tech priest Dominus Vex assured Chapter Master Cantor that such a device would revolutionize warp travel for the entire chapter fleet. The Adeptus Mechanicus escort was unusually large for a simple relic transfer. 3 Skitarii maniples and a cohort of Legio Cybernetica battle automata. I should have recognized this as the first warning sign. The journey required traversing the Straits of Hesperus, a notoriously turbulent warp corridor where reality thins dangerously. Navigator Primus Horus Tichondrian, a withered man whose bloodline had guided Imperial ships for 15 generations, expressed concerns before departure. "The Empyrean tides are restless, my lord," he told Captain Alessio Cortez in the Strategium. "Something stirs in the depths. The Emperor's tarot shows the Tower and the Betrayer in conjunction." Captain Cortez dismissed these concerns with typical Astartes stoicism. "The Emperor protects, Navigator. Your duty is to guide us true." I stood silently at his side, the weight of my force staff suddenly heavy in my hands. The Navigator's milky third eye turned toward me, and in that moment, I sensed his genuine terror. 2 days into the journey, the first anomalies manifested. Servo skulls malfunctioned, their machine spirits becoming erratic. Chronometers throughout the vessel began running backward or stopping altogether. In the librarium, I consulted ancient texts about warp phenomena, finding disturbing passages in the Codex Obscurus that spoke of temporal rifts and entities that fed upon the perception of time itself. Brother Cassius found me there, surrounded by scattered parchment and data slates. "The men are experiencing dreams, brother," he reported, his scarred face unusually pale beneath his augmetic eye. "Dreams of drowning in an ocean where the water is made of screaming faces." I closed the ancient tome before me, its leather binding made from something I dared not identify. "Tell no one else of this," I instructed him. "Increase prayer rotations and distribute blessed oils to the mortal crew." That night, as the ship plunged deeper into the warp, I performed the ritual of seeing. Seated cross-legged in my quarters, surrounded by warding candles of blessed tallow, I extended my psychic senses beyond in the hull of our vessel. What I witnessed haunts me still. The Gellar field was not a uniform bubble, as depicted in Imperial texts, but a patchwork of overlapping energy fields, each pulsing with its own rhythm. And between those pulses, in the microseconds of vulnerability, things waited. Intelligence is so alien and malevolent that the human mind cannot comprehend them without fragmenting. They pressed against our reality like predators testing a fence for weaknesses. And they were aware of my observation. They turned their attention toward me, 1,000 inhuman gazes focusing on the psychic beacon of my mind. I broke the trance with a gasp, blood streaming from my nose and ears. The Emperor's protection had never felt so fragile. The tech priests became increasingly secretive as our journey continued. They gathered around the relic in the cargo hold, performing rituals that involved connecting their own neural interfaces directly to the chronometer. When I attempted to observe these ceremonies in my official capacity as librarian, Magos Vex blocked my entry. "This is sacred work of the Omnissiah, epistolary," he stated, his voice modulated to express disapproval. "Your psychic emanations could disrupt delicate calibrations." His mechanical eyes whirred as they focused on me. "The chronometer is sensitive to warp energies. Surely you understand the need for caution." I nodded and withdrew, but stationed Sergeant Draken and his tactical squad nearby under the pretense of relic security. Draken reported that the tech priests were speaking in binary cant, too rapid and complex for even his enhanced Astartes hearing to decode. On the 7th day, Navigator Tichondrian summoned me to the navigation spire. The chamber was dimly lit by glow globes, the great throne at its center humming with power. The navigator sat connected to his instruments, his withered body sustained by tubes and cables. "We are being followed, epistolary," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical sounds of the chamber. "Something moves in our wake, matching our course corrections exactly." He removed his headpiece, revealing his third eye, the warp eye that allowed him to perceive the Astronomicon. The skin around it was cracked and blackened, as though burned from within. "It knows the chronometer is aboard. The Mechanicus have brought doom upon us all." Before I could question him further, the ship's warning klaxons began to wail. The Gellar Field had begun to fluctuate. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Marius Folk of the Iron Hand's 5th Company, and I once believed in the sanctity of our passage through the Imperium. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The warp is not merely a means of travel. It is a conscious malevolence that marks every soul that passes through its currents. I know this because I have felt its gaze upon me, studying me like a specimen pinned to parchment, helpless and aware. The taste of copper floods my mouth even now as I recall the sensation, the feeling of something vast and ancient, peeling back the layers of my consciousness during transit. The Gellar Field hummed its protective song around our void ship. But protection is merely an illusion we tell ourselves to maintain sanity. The field doesn't prevent the warp from seeing you. It merely prevents it from taking you immediately. The Imperium's patience is infinite. It remembers every soul that passes through it, marking each for future collection. I served as a librarian aboard the strike cruiser Emperor's Vindication for 73 years before I understood the truth. The Navigator Corps and the Adeptus Mechanicus maintain elaborate rituals and procedures they claim ensure safe passage. The Administratum classifies warp travel as routine, necessary risk in service to the God Emperor. But I have accessed records forbidden to all but the highest echelons of imperial authority. I have seen the statistical anomalies that the Inquisition methodically erases from official documentation. The pattern of psychic disturbances that follow certain warp-faring vessels for decades after transit. The inexplicable disappearances of crew members who reported dreams of voices during warp travel. the gradual personality shifts in veterans of numerous warp journeys. The copper taste intensifies as I record this testimony. My augmetics detect elevated stress markers, but no machine can truly comprehend what it means to have glimpsed behind the veil. The Imperium hides the truth not to protect humanity's sanity, but to maintain the illusion of control. For what is the Imperium without the warp? A fractured collection of isolated worlds, powerless and disconnected. So we continue to feed ourselves to it, one transit at a time, and call it necessity. The Imperium's tendrils are already wrapped around humanity's collective soul, tightening with each passing millennium. And we, in our blindness, call it progress. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Terran Volus, and I once believed in the Emperor's light guiding us safely through the warp. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The metallic taste of recycled air fills my lungs as I record this testimony, knowing full well the Inquisition will purge it should they discover its existence. But someone must know what truly lurks between the stars. What happens to those who travel the Imperium's twisted currents? I still remember the first time I felt it. That subtle shift when our vessel, the pious wanderer, slipped from real space into the Empyrean Sea. The Gellar Field hummed its protective mantra around us, but even then, something was wrong. The Navigator's voice over the Voxcasters assured us of safe passage, a routine transit of 17 days to reach the Cadian Gate. 17 days. How naive we were to believe time holds any meaning in that place where reality bleeds and screams. The warp is not merely a dimension of transportation as the ecclesiarchy teaches the masses. It is not simply a dangerous but necessary evil that connects humanity's scattered empire. It is consciousness itself, malevolent, hungry, and patient. The Administratum has systematically destroyed all records that speak truthfully of what happens to those who experience Gellar Field fluctuations, temporal anomalies, or worse, full exposure. I was a lex mechanic of the Adeptus Mechanicus, assigned to document warp transit phenomena. What I discovered cost me my position, nearly my life, and certainly my peace of mind. The cogitators aboard Imperial vessels contain locked files that record the true nature of warp travel, files only accessible to those with the highest clearances, files I accessed through means I dare not detail. Scene Q. Scene Q. A pale, gaunt figure in tattered red robes sits before a flickering pict recorder, augmetic eye glowing dimly in the shadows as he nervously glances over his shoulder. Robert. Section. Setup descent. Duration sec. 540. Content. My name is Terran Volus. Adeptus Mechanicus Lex Mechanic. Delta Nuspheric Clearance. Stationed beneath the fortress of the Indomitable on Hydrafor since the 13th Black Crusade, M41.9999. Before the darkness claimed me. I served aboard the Mechanicus explorator vessel Omnissiah's Blessing during the Damocles Gulf expedition. The Grand Scriptorum of Hydrafor was my home for 17 standard years. But signs of corruption were already there. Data scrolls vanishing from the archives, reports of warp transit irregularities systematically purged, witnesses transferred to distant outposts, or simply disappearing altogether. The Omnissiah's Blessing was a marvel of Imperial engineering. 3 kilometers of adamantium and ceramite, ancient technologies maintained by generations of tech priests. We traveled between systems, cataloging Xenos artifacts deemed acceptable for study, always under the watchful eyes of the Inquisition. Magos Delphinius led our expedition, his body more machine than flesh after centuries of service. I admired him then, his dedication to knowledge and truth. How could I have known that even he kept secrets from those under his command? We had completed our survey of the ruins on Bellicane, a forgotten world where human colonists had mysteriously vanished centuries before. The archaeotech we recovered was securely stored in stasis vaults, ready for transport back to Mars. Our navigator, Hieronymus Theta, plotted our course through the warp, a standard route that should have been without incident. I remember standing on the observation deck as we made the transition, watching reality tear open before our bow. The ship's choir sang hymns to the machine god, their augmetic voices designed to maintain crew morale during the disorienting shift. Fabricator Keldron placed a mechanical hand on my shoulder, his vox emitter crackling with static as he spoke. Observe carefully. Lex mechanic volus. The warp tide calculations predict minimal turbulence. That night, if such terms have meaning in the Imperium, I reviewed the standard data feeds, as was my duty. Power fluctuations in the Gellar Field generators registered at 0.0076% variance, well within acceptable parameters. The Navigator's vital signs showed expected stress patterns, nothing unusual. But there was an anomaly in the chronometric readings. According to ship's time, we had been in the warp for 6 hours. According to my personal chronometer, synchronized with Mars Standard Time before departure, only 2 hours had passed. I dismissed it as a calibration error and adjusted my device accordingly. That was my first mistake. By the third day, strange reports began circulating among the crew. Menials from the lower decks claimed to have seen faces in the recycling pipes, heard whispers from empty chambers. 2 ratings were found catatonic in a storage compartment, their eyes fixed on something none of us could see. The ship's confessor, Artemis Volk, held additional prayer services, the attendance growing with each cycle of the ship's artificial lighting. I noticed Magos Delphinius spending unusual amounts of time in the Navigator's sanctum, their discussions conducted on private Vox channels. When I inquired about the purpose of these meetings, I was assigned additional cataloging duties. Busy work to keep me occupied. On what our chronometers marked as the 7th day, I accessed the restricted archives using authorization codes I had carefully collected over years of service. The information I found was fragmentary, deliberately corrupted, but clear enough to understand why the Imperium keeps the truth hidden. Reports spanning thousands of years, from vessels of all classes and purposes, told the same story. Time flows differently in the warp, not just between real space and the Imperium, but within the warp itself. Some travelers experienced subjective centuries while their bodies aged only days. Others returned to find generations had passed, though to them the journey felt like mere hours. Worst were the accounts of those who experienced temporal loops, living the same moments repeatedly, their minds fracturing under the strain until nothing remained but hollow shells wearing human faces. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Nathaniel Karras, and I once believed in the Emperor's divine protection during warp travel. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. When the Gellar Field falters, even for a microsecond, the horrors that breach reality cannot be described by mortal tongues. I know because I have seen them with eyes not meant for such sights. The Navigator's quarters aboard the Imperial vessel, Righteous Vindication, became my prison and sanctuary for 37 standard years. As a navigator of House Belisarius, my third eye gazed directly into the Imperium, that roiling sea of madness that makes interstellar travel possible. The Administratum tells citizens that warp travel is merely a technical procedure, a simple matter of specialized crew performing their duties under the Emperor's watchful gaze. What an exquisite lie. I still remember the metallic taste that flooded my mouth when we suffered our first Gellar Field fluctuation near the halo stars. The ship's astropath screamed until her vocal cords ruptured, blood streaming from her eye sockets. 342 crewmen committed suicide within the hour, their minds broken by merely sensing what I had to look upon directly. The ship's confessor declared it mass hysteria from oxygen deprivation. Another comforting falsehood to preserve sanity. The Imperium is not merely a dimension of energy or an alternate space. It is consciousness itself, raw, unfiltered, and malevolent. The entities that dwell there hunger for the stability of our souls, our ordered minds. They press against the thin veil of reality like drowning men beneath ice. Fingernails scraping, mouths gaping. And navigators like myself are the windows through which they peer back. The Imperium's greatest secret isn't the existence of these horrors. It's that every time we traverse the warp, we invite them to follow us home. There are fates worse than death, and I have lived them all. My name was Epistolary Caius Varn of the Imperial Fists, and I once believed in the Emperor's light guiding us through the warp. I was wrong. The truth is far darker. The metallic taste of recycled air fills my augmetic lungs as I record this testimony, a warning that will never reach those who need it most. The trembling of my servos betrays what remains of my humanity, a fragment of consciousness trapped in this dreadnought sarcophagus for 3 centuries. I remember the whispers among the Navigator houses, the way they would fall silent when mortal crew approached. I remember the faces of those who returned from extended warp journeys, their eyes hollow, their minds fractured by something they could never speak of. The Imperium tells its citizens that Gellar Fields protect vessels completely, that warp travel is merely inconvenient and occasionally dangerous. They speak of warp storms and Empyrean turbulence as if discussing weather patterns. Such comforting lies. The truth would break the minds of billions. I know because I have seen it. During the Crusade of Redemption, our battle barge Eternal Vigilance suffered a partial Gellar Field collapse for exactly 9 seconds. 9 seconds. The ship's remembrancer chronicled that we lost 17 crew to warp entities. The official records speak of demons materializing and slaughtering those unfortunate souls. But I was there in the observation deck when it happened. What I witnessed was not mere slaughter. The warp did not simply kill those men and women, it unmade them. Their bodies twisted inside out while they remained conscious. Their souls extracted and reinserted repeatedly, experiencing death and rebirth in endless loops within those 9 seconds. Time has no meaning in the Imperium. For us, 9 seconds passed. For them, it may have been centuries of torment. I still hear their screams in my dreams, though my flesh body has long since turned to dust inside this walking tomb of ceramite and adamantium. The chaplains tell us that faith shields us from the horrors of the warp. Another lie. Nothing shields you completely. Nothing. The Imperium leaves its mark on everyone who traverses it, like radiation poisoning the soul. And the Imperium's greatest deception is that ordinary citizens never learn what truly happens when the Gellar Field fails, or worse, what happens even when it doesn't. Scene Q. Scene Q. Extreme close-up of ancient dreadnought eye lenses glowing dimly in darkness. Slight mechanical tremor visible in the massive frame. Section. Setups, descent. Duration sec. 540. Content. My name is Epistolary Caius Varn, Imperial Fists Librarian, entombed beneath the phalanx, our chapter's mighty fortress monastery orbiting Terra since the Redemption Crusade, M41.7 and 82. Before the sarcophagus, I fought at Hydra Cordatus when the Iron Warriors besieged the gene seed repositories. The Phalanx was my home, my sanctuary where I trained in the librarium to master my psychic gifts. But signs of corruption were already there. Headaches that lasted for days after each warp translation, visions that came unbidden in the night watches, the subtle changes in my battle brothers who had served longest aboard our vessels. I served with distinction for 87 years before the incident. Captain Darnath Lysander himself commended my service during the purging of Hive Cleomedes, where we put down a genestealer cult that had taken root in the Underhive. I remember standing upon the ramparts of the Hive's upper tiers, looking down at the sprawling metropolis as dawn broke over the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of promethium and incense, the distant sound of industrial machinery creating a constant background hum. We had lost 11 battle brothers in the fighting, their gene seed harvested and returned to the Phalanx for preservation. I had used my psychic powers extensively during the campaign, casting witchfire into the darkened corridors where the Xenos' taint lurked. Each time I reached into the warp, I felt something reaching back, something ancient and hungry that whispered promises of knowledge and power. The Navigator houses are bound to silence by ancient pacts. House Belisarius provided the Navigators for our fleet, their representatives bearing the distinctive features of their kind. The third eye covered by an ornate golden circlet, their pale skin almost translucent under the harsh lumens of the ship's bridge. Navigatrix Esmeralda Belisarius guided our battle barge through the warp for over 3 centuries. Her mind touched by the Imperium in ways even I could not comprehend. She once spoke to me in private, after a particularly difficult warp translation that had left half the mortal crew suffering from night terrors. "What we see cannot be unseen, Epistolary," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper as her gnarled fingers clutched at her robes. "The Imperium is not empty space between stars. It is alive, conscious, hungry. The Gellar Field does not keep it out entirely. It merely negotiates our passage." When I pressed her for clarification, she fell silent, her third eye twitching beneath its covering. 3 days later, she was found dead in her chambers, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official report cited natural causes. I knew better. She had said too much, revealed a fragment of the truth the Imperium keeps hidden. Chaplain Argo conducted the rites of mourning, his skull helm reflecting the flickering light of the memorial candles as he intoned the liturgies of the dead. "The Emperor protects those who journey through the warp," he declared, his voice echoing through the ship's chapel. I noticed how the mortal crew clutched their Aquilas tighter at these words, desperate for reassurance. The battle brothers showed no such comfort. We knew better. We had all felt it during transit, the subtle wrongness that pervaded the ship, the whispers at the edge of hearing, the dreams that left us waking in cold sweat despite our enhanced physiology. The Tech Marines worked constantly to maintain the Gellar Field generators, treating the machinery with a reverence that bordered on fear rather than their usual methodical devotion. Brother Librarian Titus, my mentor in the psychic arts, had warned me when I first manifested my abilities. "The warp is not simply another dimension, Caius," he had said as we stood in the fortress librarium surrounded by tomes of forbidden knowledge. "It is the reflection of all consciousness, all emotion, all thought, and what dwells there." He had trailed off, his ancient eyes clouded with memories. The Codex Astartes teaches us to use our gifts with caution, but it does not tell us the whole truth. No written word could capture what awaits beyond the veil. Titus had served for 4 centuries before his internment in a dreadnought sarcophagus. I wondered then if his reluctance to speak plainly was wisdom or cowardice. Now, I understand. Some truths are too heavy to place upon the shoulders of the uninitiated.